Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, where we'll be focusing on discussing the challenge of implementing and adopting compliance technology. We've got a good audience today, and we're excited to have the conversations. Just a few housekeeping items as we get started here. We do welcome. We will be having Q&A at the end of the session. So we've planned about 45-minute conversation with our panelists, and so feel free to, during the course of the presentation, enter your questions in the chat window that should appear on the bottom of your Zoom window. All attendees are muted and have their video off, but panelists will be visible as they speak. So please engage in the questions, and we'll address those in the last 15 minutes that we've reserved for that conversation. Also, our panelists, as you can expect, many of us are working from home. So if there are any background noises, please excuse some of those sounds. Now, to get started, I'd like to introduce some of our panelists, and happy to have this esteemed group with us, and we'll ask them to introduce themselves. So, Rick, if you want to start off.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dave. And I'm happy to be here today. Hopefully we can all learn a little bit from this webinar. So I've spent about 23 years in compliance, never intended on being a compliance officer as a career, but here I am. Started out in sales and financial services with some wirehouses. But so yeah, 23 years, mostly with one firm, and have pretty much had roles in every aspect of compliance, from a branch examiner, advertising, marketing review, surveillance, trade surveillance, responding to regulatory complaints, customer complaints, and writing processes and procedures, WSPs. I pretty much have done a bit of everything as a generalist in compliance, which has helped me succeed in my current role here as CCO at Kovack Securities and Kovack Advisors. We're a hybrid independent broker-dealer. We're independently owned, so we don't have a corporate parent, which is becoming rarer these days. My previous firm was acquired by a corporate entity, and that's where I find myself back here at a mid-sized firm where I really feel I can make a change and provide a higher level of culture and service. So yeah, so just as a general overview, about 23 years experience in compliance and supervision, and currently OSJ principal here at Kovack Securities for 350 advisors as their OSJ principal, and then the CCO for the corporate advisory, Kovack Advisors Inc. And I have about 15 compliance officers under my direct report. So that's a brief overview for me. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Rick. Jeff?
Absolutely. Thanks, Dave, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeff Welcome with Oyster Consulting. I've been in the financial services business for about 35 years now. Started as an advisor way back, and moved into the home office, taking on various leadership roles across the broker-dealer and RIA environments within the MetLife broker-dealer network. Ultimately running their retail wealth management platform, about 100 billion in assets under management at the time. And after departing MetLife with a relocation, opened up a consulting business with a partner, and then moved on into Oyster a couple of years ago. My focus these days is really on digital transformation and technology solutions, and happy to be part of the call today.
Excellent. Thanks, Jeff. And John?
Thanks, Dave. I was trained as a software engineer, and but quickly found my niche in program and project management inside of my own consulting business, which I specialized in digital automation and with focusing on ERP and CRM systems. After 20 years in that business, I sold it to a firm in Western Canada, and since then I've been working on developing, then I went into developing onboarding project management systems. For the past 16 months, I've been with InvestorCOM as a business analyst and working to onboard clients in their compliance platform, Reg BI, and rollover analyzer products. and building out onboarding system that other processes and other applications can follow. So that's kind of all that I've got for me, Dave.
That's great. Thanks, John. And I'm Dave Carprice. I'll be your host and facilitator for this afternoon. I look after the consulting services here at InvestorCOM. So if we take a quick look at our agenda, we'll start off by just talking a bit broadly about just the challenges of absorbing regulatory change, and then diving into really some of the key processes of implementing and adopting those things. So focusing on implementation and onboarding, some of the challenges around adoption and advisor engagement. And like I said, we've saved some time for questions and kind of a live discussion with our panelists. So thank you all for responding to our pre-webinar poll. We always like to kind of ask a few questions of our attendees in advance of this, just to take that opportunity to start the dialogue early. And so just want to review some of the feedback that we got from the poll. First question was around the average, or kind of your expectations around an onboarding process and project to take. And very interesting here to see about 2/3 of you think that or kind of expect that onboarding should be within 2 months. In that time frame, obviously there's a quarter of the audience that are kind of in the, I'll say, larger project, bigger implementation scale of kind of 6+ months. So that was a very interesting snapshot. The other one was a question about the role of IT. I think SaaS software or SaaS solutions generally have really kind of changed the balance of things. I mean, we see that on the onboarding side, that the expectations are shorter, but then also the involvement of your IT team. So interesting here to see that still IT doesn't go away in SaaS implementations. They're still fairly significantly involved, from the 38% where IT runs all the implementations to the remaining, or the next 50% where IT is still involved as a member of the team. The next one we looked at were just kind of expectations on, call it the customer care, customer support areas when you're dealing with your SaaS solutions, to see what those factors or the expectations are key. The top one, I think, not surprisingly, is the kind of preparation and communication of new features as they get rolled out. Sometimes that happens behind the scenes in a SaaS solution, so being aware of what's coming, I think, is key and critical. And I think some of the other ones were fairly evenly kind of identified as important across the board. The next question was kind of my favorite, or at least I was most interested in seeing how the responses played out here, especially given, I'd say, the trend with principles-based regulations. It's always interesting to see how firms view the vendor's role, whether it's a partnership or a vendor executing on a certain set of requirements. And so we asked how much guidance and support you're expecting from your vendor partners to provide in aligning compliance technology with kind of your approach at implementing the policies and procedures that go in parallel with that technology. And it's interesting that the orange and the gray colors there, fairly even split between the group that, I guess, really depends on the innovation that the vendors provide to use the technology as the starting point and then wrap policies and procedures around that, to the gray group, which is, I almost think of this as the RFP group that has a checklist of clearly defined requirements. They kind of know what they want to do and are looking for a partner to implement that. But then the sizable majority, there are 3/4 of the respondents here, really highlighting that the role of the vendor or the technology partner in these projects is kind of it is that partnership, and seeing vendors' solutions as kind of the grist for the mill to start the brainstorming on how these principles in these principles-based regulations can take form and shape, and how they may affect policies and procedures. The last question we asked was really focused on the barriers to advisor adoption. And this was kind of an open-ended, so the best way to represent this was kind of from a word cloud, where you see the size of the word linking to kind of the popularity of the response. And the biggest one here was really around what stands out is kind of getting the advisor's attention, but then also their commitment to understanding the why part of the regulation and why they're using the technology. So thank you for that. We won't kind of dig any deeper into those responses, but it is a really helpful kind of context setting exercise. So if we look at the regulatory rulemaking process, this is a well-defined, but not a straight line process. This slide kind of makes it look a little straightforward, but like a winding path. But there are, as many of you know, many roadblocks and U-turns and do-overs that can make it very unpredictable. A former colleague and ex-regulator once told me that there's kind of an emotional overlay to this process that very closely mirrors the stages of grief. If you think of, your firm's responses to recent regulations, you can probably very clearly in this winding road see where things like shock and denial, anger, bargaining, reconstruction, acceptance, and rationalization, where those all fit in this guide. So I thought that was an interesting mirror. And as I said, the backdrop for today's webinar is some of the rules that have come through this process recently. In particular, the ones we've been dealing with are supporting our regulation best interest, the client-focused reforms, and DOL's PTE 2020-02. And although client-focused reforms out of those three is a Canadian rule, and we do have both Canadian and American participants here today. So although one of the three is Canadian, there are some features that these three regulations all have in common. First, they emerged and had compliance dates during the pandemic. Secondly, they all have a fiduciary or client best interest theme that kind of is woven through them. They all had revised or staggered compliance dates. COVID probably had a little bit to do that, but I don't think that's exclusively the reason. And as I mentioned earlier, they're all principles-based rules. So it didn't come with a clear, thou shalt do this, thou shalt do that. It was more about principles, which left the door open and required a fair bit of interpretation and application at the firm level. And although of those three rules, Reg BI has been effective for 2.5 years now, all three of these are in the phase that I like to think of as the maturing phase. So this is where those who weren't early adopters are still working through their adoption, and the enforcement is still beginning, or is kind of in its early stages, where it really adds some clarity to those interpretations. And this is kind of the phase that leads to the day two, kind of where expectations, processes have evolved, best practices are identified, and compliance is really built into the status quo. So in those three regulations, I don't think we're there yet. I think we're still in that cycle of it's in force, but as an industry and as a whole, we're still kind of working at applying that and refining it and seeing that evolution. And when we think of the way in which change comes to us, we took a look at the processes that we've observed our clients follow and go through in implementing and absorbing these changes, and kind of build a parallel view of this pattern. It starts with the interpretation of these principles-based rules and say, what do they mean for us as a firm? Analyzing which apply, which don't, the gaps that may or may not exist in existing processes. Then following that, there's typically an assessment phase, talking to technology vendors, compliance vendors, maybe running pilots, doing RFPs. So kind of that procurement part of the fit process. Implementation, which involves a number of, range from simple configurations to customization and building technology, in addition to, in parallel, updating those policies and procedures. Next is the rollout and adoption. So this is really the training and launch of the applications. But then there's the ongoing, status quo part of the oversight, which includes supervision, internal audit, and the regular examination process. And as I mentioned earlier, for today's panelists, our focus really will be in these three areas of kind of what I think of that adoption process. So the vendor assessment part, implementation, and rollout and adoption. So let's start with that the assessment phase. And introduce our panelists into the conversation. And Jeff, I'll start with you. When we think of this assessment phase, what are some of the common pitfalls during this phase that you've seen, and how can you avoid them?
Yeah, Dave, it's a great question. And I think if I have to put it into a kind of a broad category, it's not taking enough time to do the assessment. And whether, that could be driven by a number of factors. Maybe there's lack of clarity on what the rule is. Maybe there's differences of opinions on how to, the need to implement it. Maybe there are timeline conflicts internally with IT, but frequently what we see is this lack of thinking it all the way through into what I call the contextual design phase. So as part of that assessment, it's really taking a look at how will the implementation of this new technology, of this new tool, impact the end user where they work, right? So in their daily environment, at their desk, wherever they're working, whatever their processes are, thinking through this whole assessment from not just what the rule is, okay, what do we have to do? Here's what we're being told, here's what the answer needs to be, but going all the way to the end user and thinking about how is it going to work its way all the way through in their processes, right? So at the end of the day, when it gets rolled out, you want to make sure that it's as easy as possible, it's as comfortable of a process as possible that doesn't change everything they do. So that contextual design phase, to me, really is a cornerstone of any successful implementation or a policy transformation that takes place.
I like that concept of contextual design. Kind of helps you think about the amount of disruption you're about to deliver. John, what are some of the things you've seen?
I want to just agree a little bit with Jeff, and I think that's probably what I experienced as an onboarding person, kind of getting the next step after the sale has been made, that sometimes there's a lack of work that's been done in that assessment phase. But I really see a broad spectrum of readiness for change. And in the 16 months that I've been there, I've seen people who are, very prepared when they come and meet with me, and some folks who just really don't have anything. Kind of really does reflect that graph that you showed with those three different sectors: people that were really dependent, some that didn't need any assistance at all, and some that leaned really heavily on the vendor for advice. From a pre-sales assessment perspective, I feel that clients really should weigh the vendor partnership aspect of of what they do with the vendor, as they're looking for guidance and best practices. There's like, we've done tons of work here at InvestorCOM, so we've got the user stories, we've got the experience of the best practices, and I'm not trying to sell, I'm just saying we know a lot, right? So if somebody says, hey, let's become a partner so that we're all sitting on the same side of the table, and we're rolling up our sleeves and we're digging into these things together and cooperatively solving problems within the framework, we really can, within the framework of the vendor solution, I think that the vendor can actually deliver a better product. I think the other thing that's important to think of is, and Dave touched on this a little bit earlier, SaaS solutions are not as much of an IT solution as they are, a deliverable product. And so the focus in IT can sometimes be, integrate everything under the sun into this application. We have to have an integrated framework, which is a really awesome concept. But it when you try to pull all that stuff in, the length of time it takes you to implement the project goes from 2 months to 6 months to a year. So the less you put in the upfront, the closer you get to satisfying your regulatory requirements, getting the thing installed internally and getting it working has to be part of that assessment. So I think that the best thing people can do is partner, start small, and adopt a continuous improvement mindset. Work with the vendor to continuously improve the solution and make it better for your firm and for your users.
That's great, John. Thanks for those tips and from what you've seen. Now, Rick, you've just gone through at least 2 cycles like this, if I think of the 3 regulations we're talking about today. Did you get caught anywhere, or was everything smooth sailing for you and your teams?
Yeah, there was some hiccups along the way, as there always will be. We felt we had, specifically through DOL PTE, we felt very comfortable in the interpretation of the rule and what we needed to do. So we assessed if we could do that internally as a firm. Did we have subject matter experts internally? in addition to our outside consultant, that we could handle this. And we determined that even though we had a great subject matter grasp of the rules, we needed a partner, a vendor, a third-party technology vendor partner that could help us implement that process. So that's when we started doing our demos with various firms like yours, and determined that we definitely need a third-party professional partner in the assessment of these rules, or in the implementation and the technology tools required to adequately meet the compliance requirements. So yeah, when we initially engaged with InvestorCOM, I think we had a grasp on compliance, but we weren't prepared for how to implement that in the rollover analyzer tool into our workflow. At which time I realized I needed to assign somebody on my team that actually knows compliance and the workflow process. So I assigned my product review principal to take the lead, and he did a phenomenal job. And working really closely with John there at InvestorCOM was critical. So we kind of got ourselves flat-footed at the initial engagement process. The implementation, we're actually rolling out the rollover analyzer on Monday. And we're up to this point, we've been using a manual process. And it took 3 or 4 months, but that was on us, in that we did, we're working on a number of initiatives in addition to the DOL PTE, Reg BI, all kinds of other processes and initiatives. So, but no, utilizing InvestorCOM was incredibly helpful in that, not just technology, but from a compliance, supervision, regulatory perspective. Definitely have the expertise there to combine technology and regulation expertise into a package. So that was been very helpful.
And you kind of used the term flat-footed, but I imagine as a mid-sized broker-dealer, like a lot of that has to do with the resources available to you and like you said, the multiple projects going on at any given time.
Yeah, obviously we're a mid-sized firm, privately held, so we have a tight budget, right? The cost of doing business in the independent broker-dealer space has been shrinking margins, profit margins. So we have to be very picky and choosy as to where we spend our resources.
Jeff, if there was a best practice that you could share with our group today about that assessment stage, what would it be?
I think 3 words come to mind. I mean, collaboration, inclusion, and feedback. So, a lot of times the assessment processes are kind of done in the shadows or behind the curtain without really talking to or engaging the end users. Some of the best practices we've seen across also different size firms is really collaborating across the spectrum. Front office, back office, end user, everybody in between. And it helps in the overall process. It helps with communication. It helps build awareness. And at the end of the day, it gives that sense of inclusion. There was a period where I focused and did a little bit of research on individual consumer behavior. And it's interesting, and it exists to this day, different retail products on the shelf outside of financial services where the product itself looks to bring the user more involved. And it's part of inclusion, right? So if you can get somebody involved with their feedback, with their advice, with their input, if you have an advisory council, if there's a compliance advisory council within the organization, bring them into the process way up front. Talk to them about what the rule is, help educate them, and then quite simply ask them for their help, ask them for their advice as you build the process out.
Oh, that's a great tip, Jeff. Thank you. Rick, anything you'd want to highlight or add that during your assessment process that really made the difference between a smoothly executed project after that versus one kind of fraught with hurdles and stumbles?
Yeah, absolutely. And I absolutely agree with Jeff about the collaboration from various folks, from the end user to the back office users. So initially I tried to take this on by myself with one other team member and realized that's not possible. We kept management in the loop. I engaged with some folks in the operations side of our back office and additional compliance folks to get varied feedback on how we want to approach this. And then we did do a pilot program with 5 advisors. It kind of beta tested the rollover analyzer tool Yeah, received their feedback. A lot of them had really good feedback, because at the end of the day, we want to make it as easy and most efficient as possible for that end user, right? Our end user, our financial advisors, they're our client. They're the ones that keep the lights on here at the firm. So I don't want to burden them with anything more than I have to based on the regulatory framework. So yeah, so that pilot program was incredibly helpful. So I would suggest any other firm adopting this type of technology or any technology. You find your set of advisors that are willing to provide that feedback, which we were able to make a lot of great changes, positive changes, some more efficiencies. You know, from a compliance standpoint and operations, we're just thinking, okay, here's the rules, here's how we have to do it. But very important to include that end user. So absolutely, that is critical.
That's great. Thanks, thanks, Rick. And John, anything you'd want to add from your last response about what you see coming out of the assessment phase, kind of hallmarks of that having done right and leading to a smooth implementation?
Well, it's interesting, what Jeff and Rick are saying kind of are stirring my gray cells a little bit. And, you know, it is the collaboration that really does make a difference in the feedback. But I think, you know, and Rick's point is getting the right people on the bus. I like that term. It's like, you know, the right people in the right seats, and they're doing the project together. I think that's a huge benefit. And, you know, the idea of being able to collect all your artifacts before you start, use a consultant if you don't have a firm kind of grasp as to where you want to take the product. But I think one of the things that's really important is to kind of build out some use cases to say, when the advisor is sitting there at the desk in front of the client, this is the sort of thing that they're going to have to be able to have as an output and an outcome. And I think building those use cases up front and using them as acceptance criteria for the project or for dealing with the vendor are really important. Really important. That's it for me.
Excellent. Thanks, John. So I want to shift into kind of the box to the right here, the implementation phase. So this is really where everything becomes real. It's where those abstract concepts have to become concrete, because it's now going to map to a configuration in a software. And while there are many case studies and resources about, you know, successful project execution and project management, I think there's something unique and special about compliance technology and how that fits. So Jeff, I'll go to you first. In your view, how is implementing compliance technology different than any other project?
And Dave, it's a really interesting question, and I like how you started out there by saying, you know, there's plenty of books out there and tools out there that talk about implementation, process, procedure, things like that. But I kind of go back and look at the whole process of change, right? And virtually, I say virtually, nobody likes change. There are some people out there who thrive on it, and look for the opportunities, you know, in any type of a change situation. But it all kind of starts with a need to understand the end user's mindset of what this change means to them. And on the compliance side of things, you know, it's a little sensitive of an area, if you will, but I think there's a nuance here between who the end user actually is and are they viewing the new tool to solve for a new rule? Are they viewing it as a need or a nuisance? Right? And if it, you know, obviously if it's a need, you're in a lot better shape. But if they're viewing it as a nuisance, that hill to climb for implementation and adoption is quite a bit steeper. So I think, you know, getting ahead of that as best you can. And that's not necessarily a short-term process. There's a cultural element of that within the firm too, right? For firms to understand that, you know, compliance isn't a must-do. It's a, you know, while it is a requirement, it's something they should adopt. They should embrace. It's part of the business. It's a good thing. And you know, it's not just this heavy-handed mandate that's coming down. So, you know, if you have that understanding ahead of time, much more likely they're going to see a new compliance tool as a need versus the nuisance.
Mm-hmm. Now, Rick, just ask you to respond to Jeff's assessment there. Does that ring true for kind of the Kovack experience or your experience about kind of the differences or the nuances of compliance technology projects?
Oh, absolutely. I agree 100%. And, there's a difference between firm policy and regulatory requirements, right? So if the advisor perceives it's a firm policy that's a little more overreaching than regulatory requirements, they do perceive it as a nuisance. So we try to make it very clear that, listen, we're implementing new policies and procedures or tools like the InvestorCOM rollover analyzer tool out of a need to meet that regulatory requirement. And we all know, when I started in the business in 1999 at a firm with 400 advisors, we had 3 compliance officers for the firm. I have about 350 advisors here at Kovack, and I have 15 compliance officers. And it's a result of this increase in regulation. But we try to make it very clear. We're on the same side of the table. We try to we emphasize that our advisors are our clients, and we're trying to set those compliance and supervision and guardrails as minimally as possible to meet the regulatory guidelines. So that is critical to let our advisors know that we're not doing anything above and beyond what we don't think is absolutely required to keep you safe, so you can continue your thriving livelihood, and it keeps the firm out of regulatory enforcement actions.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Rick. I once read an article that talked about kind of complex projects, and they described this phase of a project called the murky middle. And this was the phase where of the implementation where everything's taking longer than expected, it's more costly than expected, and the problems seem unsolvable. It's kind of the area you think, what did we do? And how did we get ourselves into this mess? And it seems like all hope is lost. Fairly bleak, but fortunately, most projects do emerge out of that phase, problems solved, and move to successful completion. And they kind of highlighted that it's really about understanding that that's a normal phase of the process and the project, but also important to know how to traverse to get through that. And so Jeff, I'm wondering if you can share any tips on how to successfully avoid or traverse that murky middle in compliance technology implementations.
Yeah, it's a great term, the murky middle. Hadn't thought of it that way before, but it really rings true with many different implementation projects that we've seen. And I think, it would be too simplistic to say it's basic project management 101. But to a large degree it is, with a very important, I think, emphasis on a project champion. So, who is the person? Make sure there is a person who has the role, not an exclusive role, not the only thing they're responsible for, but somebody who's keenly aware, and perhaps most keenly aware, of those major milestone events for the project implementation phase. And they can be the ones, and should be the ones, who are reminding folks about, there's a timeline here, there's something coming up, and they can keep that communication clear, keep it consistent, repetitive communication, that there are these milestones, and if these milestones are missed, then the timeline gets extended, and all those things nobody wants, because you get into that murky middle. But I think it does come down to some pretty basic blocking and tackling, with that focus on somebody really championing those milestone events that you really just have to hit.
No, that's great. And Rick, how have you made it successfully through to the other side?
Well, once again, we kind of started off flat-footed again. Didn't realize the resources I would need to dedicate to the process, but it was pretty very efficient in the streamlined process. So I feel having appoint or assign a project manager here at the firm to take the lead, to work directly with, specifically John there at InvestorCOM, was critical. We got caught up in some of the weeds there for a little bit. We kind of stumbled a little bit. We could have probably, like I said, completed the implementation quicker if we started out with that kind of a frame of mind. So once we did decide, hey, listen, I'm going to appoint this individual that runs my product review team as the team lead, and he took the ball and ran with it. So I think that team cooperation internally at the firm was critical.
That's great. Thanks for that insight, Rick. John, I'll turn over to you for a sec here. And I don't know the exact count, but you have the benefit of having onboard a significant number of clients, onto the InvestorCOM's compliance platform over those 18 months since you've been with us. Can you share a little bit? You've talked a lot internally, I know, about your kind of a 4-step onboarding process and how that really leads to success. I'll kind of show, put some of those steps on the screen here, and maybe provide a bit of an overview and highlighting probably the first 2 steps here, and then we'll get to 3 and 4 in our next section.
Okay, Dave. In the kickoff phase, well, one of the things in terms of a process is keep it simple and keep it so that you can use it across all of our clients. So there's no different process for client A to client B. Our process is universal. It works, and it works 100% of the time. So that was kind of my key criteria for success with designing the process. And it starts with kickoff, and kickoff is not just saying hi to everybody. It's about making sure that that the scope is very well understood. Those milestones that Jeff talked about are very well established, and that we've got the right people on the project. And part of that as well is sometimes there's maybe a little bit of distance between when the product was sold and when they're doing the onboarding. So it might be a little bit foggy as to what the product does. So part of that kickoff is always to go through the product again and say, this is what it does. This is how we can configure it to work for you. And then we introduce them to our portal, which is a place where we've just taken all of the information that we know about our product and made it transparent to the client and to our onboarding resources, as well as to our customer support team. So it's been a huge part of our process is building out that ICOM library, what we call ICOM, which is short for InvestorCOM. The next step that we get into is a design and configuration session. And this is that roll up the shirt sleeves type of event where it's about getting all of those artifacts from the client and saying, what are you using as your current process today? Let's get all of the documents that you currently have spent time and effort designing, and let's review those, and then we'll map those over to the application, find out the gaps, and now we have a starting point for a discussion. But the other thing that we do here in our design and configuration is we start talking about use cases and best practices. So this is that guidance area where clients will say, well, I really would like it to do this, or I really like to do that. And you say, well, perhaps you should think about it this way. It's just based on having done 20 or 30 of these implementations, you get a pool of knowledge of what works and what doesn't work, and what's going to help your end user buy into it. So it's really important to be able to have those use cases and that kind of thinking at this particular place. From there, we can take all of that information and boil it into some systems configuration, build out templates, artifacts, that sort of thing, and then go through a validation process. This is an iterative approach. So design doesn't happen, bang, and you're done. It's design. It's let's take a look at it, run it through those use cases, and then identify the challenges with those, make those tweaks until finally everybody says 2 thumbs up, we're good to go.
John, I'll just do a follow-up with you on one of those things. You mentioned earlier that in some cases, clients, and I'll call the rollover solution that we've been talking about a bit today as an example, where clients really don't have a starting point. So the gap analysis is kind of a comparison of 0 to a brand new process. I imagine that's significantly different versus somebody who's got a process that we're adapting.
It is, when Rick came to us, they had beautifully defined forms and processes and policies in place. And so it really made the job kind of easier because it was really a lot of cutting and pasting and you could really map things over. But a significant number of clients come with nothing. They just go, we're just here to, their goal when asked is simply to achieve regulatory compliance. And so you have to kind of insert those folks need a little bit more care because, they really do actually have an expectation, and they do have something in the back of their head, and it's just you don't know what it is. So it means that you've got to be a little bit more careful about what you do. But at the same time, it's quite simple because in a lot of cases, we'll say, well, let's take our best practices system And let's use that as our starting point. And that's such a relief to them, because they walk into the process thinking, oh my goodness, I've got so much work to do, especially as they go through all that kickoff stuff. They go, wow, their heads exploding. But then you go, listen, we've got a best practices system already. Let's start there. And in a lot of cases, I would probably say now 25% of the implementations we start with the best practices system, and we do some tweaks, and they're ready to go. And sometimes it's as short as a week, so there's a blessing and a curse that's bound up in both of those.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, John. That sounds like a bit of a lifeline in many cases. So just wanting to stay on track here with our time. Just a quick reminder, any questions, please send them through in the chat. And we're going to transition now to that third block around adoption and advisor engagement, kind of as we roll out that technology. But please send the questions in, and we'll have some time at the end of this last section to address them. So as we do this transition, despite the potential pitfalls of onboarding, it does stand out as a bit of that's the one-time activity. Once the problem is solved, it's usually solved for good. And this, in the SaaS-based world that we find ourselves in, often that places the onus on user adoption back to the firm. And I don't think that's necessarily misplaced accountability, but many firms just aren't well equipped to that transition. Now suddenly I've got the keys to the car. What's next? So we're moved from project to integrating the solution into a financial professional's day-to-day activities. Jeff, maybe I'll start with you on that one. I'm sure you and the team at Oyster have had to rescue some firms during this phase. What are some of the war stories or unanticipated roadblocks to adoption that you've encountered?
Dave, I think the biggest area that comes up that results in roadblocks are what happens when a project winds up cutting some corners, right? So I think you can go back through some of the things we talked about here already, whether it's that murky middle or, when that happens, what do? No one's looking to move an end date for implementation. So maybe, and all too frequently they look to cut corners. Rick talked a lot about the pilot program, and John talked about getting everybody on the, in the right seats on the right bus. If you cut those corners because of some other event in the middle, those all of a sudden are going to hinder and hurt the end result of the project. Right? You don't maybe you keep a pilot, but it becomes a check mark on your project list, and it doesn't have the duration it needs to. You cut out the time for the feedback and the modifications, but you still check the box. Yep, we had a pilot. Well, maybe it didn't accomplish what you needed it to do. And there's numerous examples like that, whether it's messaging, whether it's lack of understanding what the end user's thoughts are about need versus a nuisance. But it's really, I think it gets down to getting everybody on that same page, keeping everybody in line with what the messaging is, build that understanding ahead of time across the organization. I mean, on occasion, and it's unfortunate, but on occasion, some of those steps get missed. And, there may be, I'm not looking to pick on one group or another here, but, there may be a different response being given to advisors about the need for this new program, this new tool, coming from somebody on a customer service line versus somebody in operations versus somebody in, you name the department. If everyone's not giving the same message because they haven't gotten the benefit of that same level of pre-training, pre-education, pre-awareness, that can have severe impacts to the end user as well and the adoption. So I think this is where it all comes together.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jeff. Rick, what are some barriers to adoption and engagement that you've observed?
Not a lot of barriers. Most of my team, we're all on board here. The advisors, obviously, whenever you implement a new process, procedure, including a new technology tool, they're like, oh, here we go again, another process I have to do that's going to take time away from my day of trying to build my practice to doing busy work, right? The necessary evil of busy work. But like I said, with to Jeff's point, the pilot program was really critical. But the critical part of that is having the right advisors that really want to give you constructive feedback, that really dig deep into that program and say, and we're fortunate here at Kovack to have a lot of advisors that we kind of go to the same people to beta test different things with. And we're very fortunate that we have folks that really give us constructive feedback, positive, negative, or indifferent. We take it all in, and that was critical. So not sure what management was on board. You know, the owner of the firm is incredibly open-minded to making things better for the firm. So we're fortunate in that respect. We don't have to go up to some kind of a corporate parent and some kind of a corporate panel that doesn't know the day-to-day operations of our firm. So that was very helpful for us. So we've been fortunate. So I'm lucky in that respect. Having a game plan and sticking to it, right? So not cutting corners, like Jeff said. You know, you have a game plan, but then you just want to check the box that says, okay, we did this, that, and the other thing. When we did find something that we needed to fix, we focused on it, fixed it. We didn't say, let's just check the box and move on. So once again, having that game plan, the objective, and then of course, including the appropriate folks in our back office. We included folks from the account services, new accounts department, the obviously compliance and supervision, and having those folks that understand the workflows and getting the positive feedback, or the not just positive, but the critical feedback from them. So that was very important.
No, that sounds great. John, you want to kind of just touch on kind of steps 3 and 4 of the onboarding process? That's really focuses on that transition post-project.
Absolutely. It was interesting. Our rollout strategy changed quite dramatically. You know, about I don't know, maybe 6 months to a year ago, where our definition of done was when, you know, we trained the trainers and then the client could go and implement the product in their organization. And we ran a lot of different metrics on adoption of the product, and we found that the adoption process, the adoption of the product was actually low at the end user level. And so we really kind of jammed with the customer success folks and realized that, you know, the success of the product and adoption started off with that kickoff meeting. And we needed to incorporate rollout strategies in our plan, because not everybody has them, not everybody knows how they work, and so on and so forth. So we basically put together a communications plan, a rollout plan, a pilot project, and everything as a kit, essentially in our portal, our project portal, that people could follow, as well as examples of how these things work, right? For example, a welcome email with and a kickoff document and a quick start document and videos. We put it all together so that not only, you know, are they going to be good on day one, but people are coming and going all the time. And we needed the rollout was a continuous rollout, right? So when those next batch of advisors start next month, they have to roll out the product to them. So we put all those tools in place. But I think one of the key things, and I won't belabor this, but is the idea of the pilot project is so key, because, you know, you want to get those people on board that are good. If they give 2 thumbs up, they're opinion leaders within your organization. And those are the folks whose weight carries a lot. They carry a lot of weight, what they say. So it's so important to get those folks to say, we endorse this product, we've evaluated, we've given our feedback, and we're on board. Because there's nothing like a person like that can derail a project or a piece of software for you. And the last one is customer support. And everything that I do is really about supporting the client and making sure that our customer support people are able to care for our clients after the rollout is complete. And so they're meeting with our clients on an ongoing basis. You know, I'm not sure if Dave has a slide, but there's like a monthly, a quarterly meeting, annual meeting, and they all have different kind of aspects to them. But their primary objective is adoption, getting those advisors feeling really comfortable with the software, and making sure that you're having success with your software from us.
That's great. Thanks, John. So just kind of last question to Jeff and Rick. Jeff, what have you seen keys to successful engagement and adoption at the financial professional level?
Yeah, I think, Dave, you know, at the end of the day, and it's interesting, I did a blog recently with an Oyster Consulting, and I talked about carrots, right? So celebrate success, right? And just because it's compliant software doesn't mean it gets delivered. It's the old adage, right? The carrot or the stick, right? So things don't need to be delivered with the stick. Celebrate the successes. I love what John was just talking about the advisors and the customer success stories. Promote them. Everybody likes to get the spotlight once in a while. Use those carrots. Put a few rewards out there. It's tough these days what you can do and can't do, but you can always do communications and spotlight the early adopters. Spotlight the people who've used this as to their advantage to improve the efficiency, to allow them to do more revenue producing activities by leveraging tools. But really think about it from that perspective of where can you highlight the successes, promote them, put them out in front of people, and firms may be surprised by the reaction they get and others wanting to be part of that process the next time something comes around.
That's great. And Rick, any last secret you'd want to share around the key to a successful advisor adoption?
Yeah, I agree with the comments Jeff made regarding highlighting folks that were helpful. But once again, I'm going to go back to the teamwork. It was incredibly important to engage with all folks within the firm, even people that aren't directly related to the project, to include everybody as much as possible on our management meetings and our firm-wide meetings. We were keeping people updated as to the progress, as to why we're implementing the rule, and educating and engaging with all folks within the organization. And then also having, we send out we have a weekly newsletter, email newsletter goes out to all our advisors. So we've been keeping them up to speed with that for the past 4 or 5, 6 months. When we first engaged prior to our engagement with InvestorCOM, and then after, constantly updating them as to the rule, what the tools we're going to be rolling out, the training that we're going to provide. I think that's a huge process. You don't want to just drop it on them one day and say, hey, all of a sudden you have to use this tool, here's a new procedure. You want to slowly lead them up to that point where they're prepared for it, they understand why they have to do it, and they're on board with it.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. And just as we transition into the Q&A, the one last thing I want to highlight, John talked about how, about a year ago, we dramatically changed our rollout process after having, realizing the job doesn't quite end once you've trained the trainers. And so in that vein, we're actually in the process of expanding that, call it the onboarding into an advisor engagement program. And we won't go into the details here today, but really focusing on some of those key principles of, surround sound. How do we get information in the hands of financial professionals as frequently as possible? Micro learning, so that they're in the smallest bits possible, that it's easy to digest, and that they know the what and the why. Often technology training focuses on, how to do step A, step B, click here, click there, but it needs to be connected to the why. I think Jeff, or you may have mentioned, whether it's financial policy or the firm's policy, then that seems like you're going overboard versus regulation, right? And the why is regulatory why, the what's in it for me, that fact that best interest leads to happy clients is good for business. And then also the other, call it incentives, recognition, CE credits, etc. Scenario based, I need to go to this tool when a prospect comes to me with this, or a client comes to me with these questions. And then really those ongoing touch points, even while we roll into kind of the status quo of the technology being with the firm. We actually did a lunch and learn for a client a couple months ago, and who had been on the platform for about 6 months. And after a 30-minute lunch and learn, saw the needle move on, and we asked them, just feeling comfortable with what to do and when to do it, increased by 75%. Through just that 30-minute information session and a chance to ask some of their key questions. So that's really been our focus at, how to keep moving and advancing, how to bring clients onto the platform and make the most use out of that. And with that, that kind of ends the content portion, and I want to transition into the Q&A. Any last questions, feel free to, again, add them to the chat and we'll address them. Right now, so we've got about 5 minutes, and we've got one in here that I'll highlight, and maybe as we're talking about that, if anybody else has a question, feel free to enter that. The first one, Jeff, or sorry, actually Rick, it's probably directed at you. It doesn't say, but basically says, in a resource constrained environment, how do you get the right people on the bus? So I don't think that's a question about who the people are, but I think the challenge is more, how do you get that executive buy-in to free people up, the right people, to do the things you need them to do?
Well, yeah, obviously it's part of that is education, and you know, a lot of folks, you have to approach it in a sometimes in a delicate way, right? Especially when it comes to management, and it might include an additional cost on the bottom line budget. But explaining why it's critical that we need to adopt maybe these new procedures, maybe we need to adopt new technologies to comply with those procedures. Once again, it's education, and it's open communications and transparency, I think, are critical.
That's great. Jeff, anything you'd want to add to that?
No, I think that's really what it comes down to. And again, it's all about that communication and helping them understand what the benefit is, right? Not just for the end user of them being involved, but there should be a benefit for them to be in that position too, to be asked to be part of that, taking one of those seats on the bus, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and let me just add quickly to that, if I may. Some of the guidance we've received from regulators are, if firms are found in violation of the DOLPT rules, there are significant repercussions, including the possibility of not being able to conduct qualified rollover business. So any firm that would not be able to do qualified rollover business, they would probably be out of business.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's significant motivation. Another question came in here.
It's positive operating condition, positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, but a combination of the two help get the message across.
Yeah. Another quick question here. Rick, you commented on your weekly newsletters, and just a question on the content of those. Was there anything included in the newsletter, or anything else other than projects specific stuff, or was it like the regulation, technology, or even just other things?
Great question. So throughout the newsletters, it provided a lot of education on the rule itself. But in our last communication last week, we created a, so InvestorCOM, you have some great training videos, but because the tool is the role of our analyzer tool is so customizable, which is incredibly a positive thing, we created our own, and we tweaked it, we customized it to our business model. So we did include in that newsletter a link to a training video. It's a brief 10-minute training video with our new process, and we also included a link to a workflow, basically a workflow chart, step A down to step B, C, etc., for the full process. So including those additional steps, I think is going to be very helpful for our reps when this does roll out on Monday.
That's excellent. So we are at time. For any of those who asked some questions that didn't get answered, we will reach out back to with the communication to make sure that's being addressed. But in the meantime, thank you to all of you who participated this afternoon, and special thanks definitely to Rick, Jeff, and John, for your valuable time and input today. Thank you, and have a great day.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Dave.